This Notebook LM video explores the dramatic transformation of Christianity from a persecuted faith built on martyrs into a powerful institution that persecuted its own people. It explores how the cross, a symbol of state-sponsored execution, became a symbol used by crusaders and inquisitors enforcing state power.
Today we are going to trace one of the most unbelievable reversals in all of history. Seriously, it's the story of how a faith that was literally built on the suffering of martyrs, people who were persecuted, somehow transformed over centuries into a global power that persecuted its own people with fire and with swords. How on earth does that happen? Well, that's the dark, complicated journey we're about to take. So this is the big question, right? You really have to think about it for a second. How did the cross, the ultimate symbol of a victim of a state-sponsored execution, end up becoming the very symbol held up by crusaders and inquisitors who were enforcing state power? It's a mind-bending transformation. So let's dive in and unpack the key turning points that made this all possible. Okay, so our story really kicks off with the first and, honestly, the most critical turning point. And it wasn't some big debate over a piece of scripture that lit the fuse. Nope. It was a complete, fundamental change in Christianity's relationship with the one thing that matters most on earth, the power of the state. But first, before we go any further, we've got to get on the same page about a really important word here, heresy. You see, in the early days, being a heretic just meant you had the wrong opinion in a theological debate. But as we're about to see, the meaning of heresy is going to shift big time. It's going to go from being a simple spiritual mistake to a political crime, a crime that threatens the entire social fabric and eventually becomes punishable by death. I mean, just look at how fast this all happened. It's absolutely staggering. In 303, Christians are literally being hunted down and killed by the Roman Empire. By 380, that's less than one person's lifetime, their faith is the Roman Empire. Can you imagine being born in 303 and living to see that? Your entire world would be turned upside down. And just like that, disagreeing with the church was now a crime against the state. In a single generation, the persecutor inherited the persecutor's sword. And this right here is where everything pivots. Once the threat from Roman paganism was gone, the newly empowered church turned its attention inward. The enemy wasn't the pagan on the outside anymore, it was the Christian who disagreed on the inside. All of a sudden, theological arguments like Arianism, which was a debate about the nature of Christ, they weren't just spiritual issues, they were political problems, seen as a threat to the unity of the entire empire. And then it happened. Just 5 years after Christianity became the state religion, a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. In 385, a theologian named Priscillian was executed. This was a massive deal. For the very first time, the power of the state was used by Christians to kill another Christian over a disagreement in doctrine. Now, it's true, a lot of major church leaders at the time, like St. Martin of Tours, they were horrified. But it was too late. A really dangerous precedent had just been set. Okay, let's fast forward a few centuries to the High Middle Ages, because that dangerous precedent, it's about to evolve from being a one-off event into a highly organized, systematic, and even militarized machine built for one purpose: suppression. And one of the first major targets for this new machine was a group in southern France known as the Cathars. Now, their beliefs were pretty radical. They thought the entire physical world was evil, and they totally rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, the priests, the sacraments, all of it. To the Pope in Rome, this wasn't just a difference of opinion. This looked like a rival church, a kind of cancer growing right in the heart of Christendom, and in their eyes, it had to be cut out. So, in 1209, Pope Innocent III does something that had never been done before. He calls for a crusade not against Muslims in some far-off Holy Land, but against fellow Christians right there in Europe. And he added a really powerful incentive. He told the nobles of northern France that if they went and fought, they could just keep the lands of the southern lords they conquered. And just like that, faith got mixed with greed. Heresy was now an excuse for total war. And the pure brutality of this war is captured in one, frankly, terrifying quote. As the Crusaders were storming the city of Béziers, they apparently asked the Pope's representative how they were supposed to tell the good Catholics from the heretics. His supposed reply, "Kill them all, God will know his own." That one line tells you everything you need to know about the fanatical violence that had just been unleashed. But the crusade was really just the beginning. To finish the job, the church created a formal institution, the Inquisition. This wasn't just mob violence. This was organized bureaucratic terror. You had trained friars acting as investigators and judges. You had interrogations, often using torture to get confessions. And here's the clever legal loophole. The church itself claimed it never killed anyone. It would just find someone guilty of heresy and then hand them over to the local government to be burnt at the stake. So now we land at the Reformation. And maybe the biggest irony in this whole story. This was a movement that started as a protest against the abuses of the Catholic Church. Its leaders were all about freedom of conscience. But, as we're going to see, as soon as they got power, many of them turned right around and denied that exact same freedom to anyone who dared disagree with them. The pattern was about to repeat. And the contradiction is just, it's right there in black and white. On one hand, the reformers are demanding freedom of conscience. But on the other, they're executing Anabaptists by drowning them, which was a sick parody of their belief in adult baptism. They're shouting, "Scripture alone," and then they burn a man at the stake because his interpretation of that scripture was different. They rejected the Pope's authority, only to set up their own rigid state-enforced religious governments. The most infamous example of this has to be the case of Michael Servetus. He was a brilliant Spanish thinker who was actually on the run from the Catholic Inquisition. But his beliefs, especially his rejection of the Trinity, were considered just as heretical by the famous Protestant leader, John Calvin. So when Servetus made the mistake of passing through Geneva, he was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Now, this brutal act didn't go unnoticed. It sparked a lot of outrage, and one theologian, Sebastian Castillo, wrote this incredibly powerful and simple response. This quote is so important. It's one of the first, clearest arguments for religious toleration in modern Europe. It's a brand new idea, literally forged in the fires of seeing the persecutors become the new persecutors. And all of this leads us to our final turning point, the slow, agonizing realization that trying to force everyone to believe the same thing was not just cruel, it was completely self-destructive. The unbelievable cost of intolerance would eventually, painfully, push Europe toward a totally new way of thinking. For more than 100 years after the Reformation began, Europe basically just tore itself to pieces. You had conflicts like the French Wars of Religion and the 30 Years' War in Germany. These weren't just battles, they were total catastrophes. Entire generations were wiped out, millions of people died, and huge parts of the continent were left in ruins, all in the name of enforcing the one true version of Christianity. If you want to get a sense of the scale of the horror, just look at this one number. This is the estimated death toll from a single event, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. It started in Paris when Catholic mobs began hunting down and slaughtering thousands of French Protestants, known as Huguenots. The violence just exploded across the country. This wasn't a battle, this was a state-approved mass murder, fueled by nothing but religious hatred. And the path away from all this madness was not a straight line at all. As you can see, you'd get these glimmers of hope, like the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which gave Protestants some rights in France. But then you'd get these huge steps backward, like when that same edict was just canceled less than 100 years later, starting a whole new wave of persecution. It was only after centuries of bloodshed and total exhaustion, combined with these radical new ideas from thinkers like John Locke, that a new solution started to take hold: the separation of church and state. So, after this very long, and let's be honest, very bloody journey, what's the big takeaway? What has this whole history taught us about what happens when belief gets mixed up with power? Well, the pattern, as we've seen, is tragically consistent. Whenever any single belief system gets fused with the absolute power of the government, the results are pretty predictable. What was once just a disagreement over ideas becomes a crime against the state. What was dissent becomes treason. And we see it again and again. The victims of one generation's persecution become the architects of the next, all at a completely devastating human cost. Now, today, in a lot of the Western world, the whole idea of heresy as a state crime is basically gone. The rise of secular governments, which are built on the idea of protecting individual rights, was designed specifically to break that toxic link between religious authority and state power. Disagreements over what you believe have been moved out of the courtroom and away from the executioner's block and back into the realm of debate and personal conscience, where they belong. But that fundamental tension, it hasn't just disappeared. The deep human need to believe something strongly and the temptation to use power to force other people to agree with you, that didn't die out in the 18th century. It just learned to speak a different language. So the final question I have for you is this: where do we see that line being tested today? Where do modern belief systems, whether they're political, social, or something else, use new kinds of power to punish their own heretics? Let us know what you think down in the comments.